In the 1970s, Pierre Trudeau learned the art of politics. He had come to the profession late in life, without an apprenticeship, and won power easily. It was only when he nearly lost the Prime Minister's job that he adopted a more methodical approach to holding on to power. He came to see a relationship between nature, politics, and governing.
The art of governing in politics perhaps has some parallels with the art of directing a canoe in white water. If you just let yourself drift, then you're not really governing. That's like letting the poles tell you where the river's going and then decide to follow the river. If you want to govern people, it means you have to choose a path in the river. It means that you have to avoid the rocks. You have to know what rapid you can shoot and which you have to portage. And there's a symbiosis between the person, the canoeist, and the water, which is partly cooperation. The movement comes from the people, from the country, which is advancing with all its needs and its wants. Suddenly you find yourself dumped out of your canoe or just submerged. So you're on your own. The canoe is going down with sometimes your only worldly goods, possessions. And you with your feet forward and your hands braking, you sort of try and find a calm spot at the end of the rapid. Happens. Get cold, build a fire, dry yourself, start out the next day.
In his first term, Pierre Trudeau wanted to govern Canada in a new way. His motto was reason over passion. His approach was highly academic and intellectual. He surrounded himself with like-minded, elitist thinkers. In pursuit of his utopian vision of a just society, Trudeau was often isolated by his palace guard, cut off from reality.
So we spent a lot of time looking at flow charts and graphs and plotting our courses and everything else. We even did that during the FLQ crisis, trying to see what the next move of the terrorists would be and how we would counter it and what you did with the media and the police and the army and everything else. I suppose an experienced politician would have looked at disgust with some of that, but I wasn't an experienced politician.
In 1972, the would-be philosopher king called an election. Trudeau said he wasn't going to fight the opposition. He would be above crass politics, just communing with the electorate. His slogan, "The land is strong."
In 72, I was, Mr. Sandfield, he's trying to win the election, that's fair. Mr. David Lewis, he's trying to win the election, that's fair. You listen to them, you listen to me, and you choose the best party. They almost didn't choose us.
Prime Minister Trudeau is now coming into the Liberal room at the Skyline Hotel.
When the 1972 election results came in, the Liberal majority was gone.
It's not a cheery moment for Mr. Trudeau. It's fair to say that Trudeau-mania is dead.
That night, it was not clear that Trudeau would even be able to form a government.
Is there a phrase I can re-quote to you that I used some months ago? Whether or not it is clear to you, no doubt the universe is unfolding as it should. Good night. I always thought that politics was a game, and I always think I can win, but you can lose, obviously, and you're ready for that. So it was a short, brief career, but I had to go at it, and now I know I'll go back to something else. I certainly didn't feel devastated. I think within a day or two I was feeling terribly challenged now. How can I improve this for the next time?
Trudeau was determined to fight for his political life. He had a house cleaning of advisors and a cabinet shuffle, and prepared for his first encounter with a minority parliament. It would be a four-way tug of war. His major opponent would still be Conservative leader Robert Stanfield, but NDP leader David Lewis would hold the balance of power. And Quebec's social credit leader Réal Cahouette was a wild card.
How do I govern? By dividing them, preventing them from coming together and putting my government in a minority position. It means, and I began, if I remember correctly at that time, in caucus with tongue-in-cheek but half seriously describing to them the Battle of Napoleon at Austerlitz. And people would sometimes remind me of Waterloo, but I said, no, this battle is Austerlitz. You know, you're fighting, it's three emperors fighting. We had four in this case. We got to divide them, and we got to come up the middle, and we got to trick them into complacency and confidence, and we've got to drown them in the marshes.
New Democratic Party leader David Lewis and his caucus came up with what they called a COD policy, a shopping list of demands that Trudeau would have to satisfy if he was to retain power.
Is he talking?
Trudeau and another NDP leader, Ed Broadbent, both fondly remember the legislation of that minority parliament, which included increases in old age pensions and family allowances, a job creation plan, action to halt rising food prices, and personal income tax cuts.
And again, as unbiased as I'm not, I think if it hadn't been for the NDP's presence, of course, and the necessity of building, if you like, a center-left coalition as opposed to another one, these things wouldn't have happened.
You have no argument from me. I was not unhappy that I was given a reason, a political reason, to do what very often my ideology wanted to do. I was on the left of the Liberal Party, and now I had a good argument. Geez, if we don't get the NDP with us, we won't be the government anymore.
All the spending programs of the minority parliament would put a severe dent in the Canadian Treasury, but they substantially increased the popularity of the Trudeau Liberals. When the polls turned in the Liberals' favor in 1974, they stage-managed their own defeat on a budget vote to trigger an election.
When we were finally going to be defeated, we actually engineered that defeat. We put things in that budget which we knew the NDP couldn't support, and others which we knew that the Tories couldn't support. And we made sure that there was something that would get both of them to vote against us. But we knew that there was also the kind of thing in it that we could go to the people with and see these guys defeated it. They're just hungry for power.
We want every Liberal in this country, indeed every citizen, who is prepared to look fairly at the achievements of our government, who is prepared to compare us, as John Turner says, not to the Almighty, but to the alternative.
In 1972, Trudeau had been disdainful towards the high-powered backroom boys of Canadian politics, the pollsters and marketing men like Keith Davey and Jerry Grafstein. In 1974, they were back.
Goldfarb's polling was very instrumental.
They had elaborate strategies based on surveys, charts, and graphs.
That was the beginning of, I think, looking at leadership as a component, and that was the big bar graph in all the polls that I saw, which was how do you deal with this, and the question is how you contend with the question of leadership.
Yeah, I remember you'd show me those complicated questions about who do you think is the least arrogant or the best leader, and I'd always turn out
You won everything.
You're bad on arrogance, but you're great on leadership.
But no, I won on arrogance.
Yeah, you won on arrogance, that's right. It was a high graph on arrogance.
It became very clear to us that leadership should be the issue, because if leadership was the issue, we were going to win the election.
The Pierre Trudeau of the 1974 campaign was very different than the 1972 version. Crass politics were back in. Elitism was out.
I said, well, obviously my way hasn't worked. I almost got defeated in '72. I guess the party machine that my father used to talk about when I was a 5-year-old boy means something. Let me learn something about it. Obviously, the machine wasn't cranked up, whatever it is. And whatever it is, of course, I knew by then was getting the party not only involved intellectually, but emotionally and and keeping certain contacts, giving certain appearances of not being aloof, and so on.
In 1974, the Liberals brought out a new secret weapon, Trudeau's young wife, Margaret.
I've been joining my husband on the campaign in the last few weeks. I want to speak to you a bit about my husband because I feel I have some inside information.
In 1974, one part of the Liberals' more traditional approach to the election campaign was the showcasing of Margaret Trudeau.
Margaret has heard this speech before, so she's inside while I'm making the speech, feeding the baby.
I don't know how you do all this, but this is your first one. Yeah, I'm very gracious.
Margaret would soften the Prime Minister's image. She testified that he was not nearly as arrogant as he was made out to be.
I think I can speak to you of him as a person, as a very loving human being who has taught me in the 3 years that I've been married to him and the few years before I was married to him, a lot about loving, which is something incredible.
Trudeau was ambivalent about Margaret's campaign role.
I'm not sure if it was the right or the wrong thing to do. I think Margaret did help, in fact, with the public. People wanted to see her, and she would make the odd speech, which was not only odd, but good sometimes, and I think she helped. I can't say I was all that comfortable with it, and I don't think it happened again in any other election, but why not try it once?
The major issue of the 1974 campaign became Bob Stanfield's proposal for wage and price controls to fight inflation.
That's the main purpose of our short-term freeze of prices and incomes for a period of 90 days.
He made the mistake that, I suppose, in military terms, you say when the enemy puts the army in the field, then you can snipe at it from everywhere.
Price and wage controls are really only a proven disaster which are looking for another place to happen. And we're not going to let it happen in Canada.
My attack was that, look, we're just a few months after the first OPEC crisis. Price of energy looks as though it's going to go through the roof. How are you going to control that? How are you going to freeze the price that is being set in the Middle East by the OPEC cartel? And you know, you can't just say, zap, you're frozen, and you're not going to pay more for your oil. These are the people who are setting the price of your oil. When I saw that that was a successful line and that he was getting into the mud in the field, naturally it was a simple message and maybe a tactical use of the error of an opponent. I used it, and I won the election. Canada has come out of this election strong.
Many have suggested that in the sweeping election victory of 1974 were the seeds of Pierre Trudeau's eventual defeat. He had made promises that would be hard to keep and raised the expectations of those around him to a level that could not be sustained.
The election period is over. I want to thank you, Margaret, for your great help. We'll get on with the job, both our jobs.
After the victory celebration came the hangover. The Canadian economy sank into stagflation, surprise increases in both inflation and unemployment. And in the next few years, many of Trudeau's senior ministers decided to leave his government. The first to become disenchanted was Finance Minister John Turner. Turner was the most powerful member of the cabinet, seen as the natural successor to Trudeau. But after the 1974 election, he was feeling undervalued, underappreciated. On September 10, 1975, Turner went to Trudeau's office with a resignation in his pocket. But many are convinced he did not really want to quit.
Why do you want to go? Stick around. We're just beginning this new mandate. It's a fun thing. Well, what are your reasons? And he sort of said, well, you know, it's the time in life, and I've got my family to look after, and I've discussed it, and I've told a few of my friends and advisors that I was going to resign, coming to give you my resignation. And so I said, well, John, if there's, you know, if it's, that's your destiny as you see it, I'll accept your resignation. I'm sorry, but good luck, and let me know if there's anything I can do. So tell me I handled it badly, tell me I should have got down on my knees and begged him to stay, but that's not the way I saw politics. I thought politics is a difficult game. You have to have your heart in it. If his heart wasn't in it for one reason or another, either because of the leader or because of his private life or because of the economic circumstances or his body language, if he wanted to go, I wasn't going to sort of say, well, stay on.
After Turner's departure, there was much criticism of Trudeau's handling of the economy. In the mid-1970s, the government was spending a lot more than it was taking in, but Trudeau was not worried about the deficit. He was following the prevailing economic theory of the day, that government should spend money when times are bad, then tax it back when the economy improves.
It was following our priorities, and my priorities were the just society. And so what's a deficit? If it's going to be corrected by the swing of the cycle in a few years, we got to spend the money now.
But the economic cycle did not swing back, and the Canadian government sank ever more deeply into debt. Trudeau says he spent the money to help the poor and unemployed, but some suggest he was also trying to buy votes for the Liberal Party.
I think buying us votes, I hope it wasn't foremost in my mind. The Liberal Party has always been motivated by the need for more justice, and if it helped us keep in power for a great number of years, so much the better.
Trudeau also maintains he was trying to prevent social upheaval.
Look at the FLQ in Quebec, a whole number of years of bombings and so on. The danger is that when society is not providing a modicum of justice to everybody, people revolt or are discontent with the governing system.
In the 1970s, a vast amount of the Canadian economy was owned by foreigners, especially by Americans. The Trudeau government created Petro-Canada to increase Canadian presence in the oil industry, which was almost 90% foreign-controlled. Trudeau also introduced the Foreign Investment Review Agency to screen foreign takeovers of Canadian companies. He received many complaints about the policy from foreign leaders, even from his close friend, the German Chancellor, Helmut Schmidt.
I said, but Helmut, all countries do that. I just hear that your own, for instance, you've told the Deutsche Bank not to permit the sale of Mercedes-Benz to Arab benefits. Oh, yeah, but he says this isn't a system. This was, you know, we just took that decision because Mercedes-Benz is very important to us, and it's a matter of pride and everything else. They were all defending their economies, but here Canada wasn't allowed to do it, even though we were living next to the greatest industrial power in the history of the world.
By 1975, inflation was the #1 economic problem for the government. Canadians had come to expect massive increases in wages and prices. Trudeau felt things had changed, that inflation was now being driven by domestic forces, not foreign oil prices. He resolved to break the inflation psychology, but knew it would carry an enormous political price for him. On Thanksgiving Day, the Prime Minister went on television to impose the wage and price controls he had campaigned against only 16 months earlier. It was a shocking about-face.
Under this program, a selected number of powerful groups in Canada will be required by law to obey strict guidelines on any increase in prices they charge and incomes they earn.
What do you think your reversal on wage and price controls cost you politically?
Probably a great amount, because I think until then I was respected as a straight-shooting guy who told the truth as he saw it and wasn't just a devious politician who would say one thing and then go out and practice another. So it wasn't good politics for me to bring them in when I had said they won't work. course, I was saying they won't work in other circumstances when the inflation was caused from the outside.
Trudeau's imposition of wage and price controls contributed to an impression that his government was floundering, becoming directionless. He was advised to enunciate a more forceful agenda, but was clearly preoccupied with another matter: his marriage. In public, the Trudeaus projected an image of the perfect couple. But privately, both of them were struggling with the transition from being single to the constraints of wedlock, as Trudeau acknowledged in a 1975 interview with the BBC.
You know, a marriage can be a regressive institution. You're young, you're free, you've at last got rid of parental authority. Suddenly you get married, and authority is there again, and you don't have to report your mother, you have to report your wife, or she doesn't have to tell her dad why she's ill. So it can be a regressive institution. And for all married couples, it can be a traumatic experience. I think husbands, or particularly when they're busy, as I was, are not as sensitive to that as they should be. Hopefully we learn.
After playing such a prominent role in the '74 campaign, Margaret felt cast aside after the victory. She was less and less comfortable in the traditional background role of politician's wife. The strain took its toll on the relationship.
Some of the problems of being in politics, as every politician knows, is that it's not always a good life for the spouse. The man or the woman in it is fighting all the time, but the one who stays back home with the kids is just hearing about the nasty aspects of it and not enjoying the fight.
Margaret entered hospital and publicly announced that she was having emotional problems. When she ran off to spend a weekend photographing and partying with the Rolling Stones, the country was talking about little else. In 1977, on American television, Margaret said the marriage was over.
For Pierre and I, it's been a very tragic kind of experience to go through, as it is for any couple that is realizing that their marriage has broken down.
For Trudeau, the strain of the marriage breakup was obviously difficult to bear. Colleagues say he became almost paralyzed at work. He believes that anyone who has suffered a divorce will understand what he went through, but it's a topic he now refuses to discuss. Trudeau's conduct in those difficult personal moments won him a lot of new sympathy and support from Canadians. His public image slowly made the transition to single parenthood, and he moved on. The Prime Minister's troubles were not over, though. He soon found himself back in a fight he thought had been long settled: the battle for a bilingual Canada. The central crusade of Pierre Trudeau's career was the campaign for bilingualism. The principal objective was to preempt the separation of Quebec by making French Canadians feel at home all across Canada. The 1 million francophones who live outside of Quebec have the most at stake in that battle. One of the largest groups of francophones outside Quebec are the Acadians of northern New Brunswick. The Acadian struggle is immortalized in the story of La Sagouine, the wise washerwoman who symbolizes her people's will to survive. Trudeau was taken with the story, created in 1969 by the award-winning Acadian writer, Antonine Maillet.
So your Acadian identity isn't just a function of the language, it's
much deeper.
An attitude of life.
It's an attitude, and it's a struggle for survival.
Yes. Is it still struggling, or is the victory over?
No, it's not the victory yet, but it's a struggle. All the time, the people have to define themselves, have to believe that they're going somewhere. And when we go somewhere, we can only go up. If we go down, then it's the end of us.
I always believed in the superiority of a multinational society. Very few countries are left which can say, well, we're all of the same ethnic stock. But even if we wanted to say that in Canada, it's not true. we would have to leave hanging in the wind all the French minorities across the country, which the separatists say quite frankly that they're prepared to do. When asked about it, René Lévesque said in Winnipeg, well, the French here are dead ducks, which is one concept, but it was never mine.
In 1975, Canada seemed to start moving away from the Trudeau vision of national bilingualism. When air traffic controllers in Quebec asked Ottawa for the right to communicate in French to local pilots, there was an immense reaction against the demand in the rest of the country.
There'd been some very nasty scenes. I remember going west in those days and being jeered by the pilots and the air controllers lined up at the airport. And I remember even air stewardesses, as they were then called, coming buttonholing me in my seat and sort of saying, now you must understand that you're endangering the lives of our passengers and so on. You know, it was another balloon which burst as soon as people knew the facts. And you never hear anybody now say, we're not going to fly over Quebec because some guys down there in their Piper Cubs are speaking French to the air controller.
During that crisis, Trudeau's Minister of Transport, Otto Lang of Saskatchewan, was afraid of an explosion of anti-bilingualism feeling in English Canada that could well destroy the government. He urged a cautious approach. Jean Marchand, Trudeau's close friend and senior Quebec minister, urged bold action to immediately allow French in Quebec air traffic control.
Yourself, sir?
Trudeau was torn. He decided to back Otto Lang and was shocked when Jean Marchand quit the cabinet.
I've got Jean's letter of resignation.
Marchand had recruited Pierre Trudeau to politics and was his political mentor. Now, after 11 years together in Ottawa, he was gone.
It left an enormous hole. I'd already had a departure. Pelletier left around that time, too. I think he was already our ambassador in France when the Jean de Léon thing exploded. So, Pelletier, in his case, had told me anyhow he was going to stay so many years in politics, 65 to 75, and he went, so I was expecting it. But in the case of Marchand, who was the leader of our group and who was the chief fighter of our cause, that he should leave caused me a great deal of distress.
In the mid-70s, the trend away from bilingualism was also evident in Quebec. Nationalist demonstrators filled the streets calling for laws to protect the French language. The pressure was on Quebec Premier Robert Bourassa.
He was afraid of the nationalists, and he would tell me his strategy was to try and get the people to move from the PQ to him, because the PQ seemed to be growing around 74, 75. And I said, well, just, never mind, you'll never be a nationalist enough for the separatists, so don't try. Use your strength, the federalist people of Quebec, the people who believe in Canada, and try and govern for their benefit before worrying about peeling off a few extra voters from the PQ sides. Well, it wasn't his way.
The Prime Minister's relations with the Quebec Premier became progressively cooler. When he arrived for lunch at the Premier's office in 1976, the media made much of his jokes about Bourassa's plebeian tastes.
What are you expecting for hot dogs? Only hot dogs? Hot dogs, yeah. All right.
But Trudeau said what really annoyed him was that Bourassa had begged him to allow the Queen to visit Quebec City before opening the Montreal Olympics, and then got the jitters.
When I came to see him at that lunch, he said, and by the way, you know, I think I'd like you to change the arrangements and make sure the Queen doesn't come to Quebec, that she's not seen in Quebec. Well, I said, I think she's coming by boat. What are you going to do, fly the boat up to Montreal? And he said, no, 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 but don't have her stop here and make sure she doesn't stop. Well, I said, you're the one who asked us to set the program. It's all fixed. The Queen has said yes. The Britannia is on the way, or was it? It was going to come. And now you're doing the concert. You know, can't you make up your mind? And I was pretty impatient with that.
Not long after, hostilities between Bourassa and Trudeau broke into the open. The Premier brought in his language legislation, Bill 22, which limited access to English schools in Quebec. Trudeau knew the move would cause even more backlash against bilingualism in the rest of the country.
It's just what I call political stupidity. One of my strongest criticisms is that Bill 22 talks about French as the only official language of Quebec. You know, if they had only said the main language, the principal language, the working language, la langue nationale, it would have made things so much easier for us liberals in the rest of the country when we're saying to the rest of the country there are two official languages, French and English.
In the fall of 1976, from his bunker in Quebec City, Robert Bourassa called a provincial election. It was a turning point for Canada. Bourassa was in good spirits, seemingly oblivious to the disenchantment with his corruption-tainted government. René Lévesque was also buoyant. Trudeau's old nemesis had put the separation question on the back burner, promising the issue would be decided by a referendum. All he had to do in the election campaign was exploit the unpopularity of Bourassa. On November 15th, English Canada was staggered by the Quebec election result. The PQ campaign song was Demain nous appartient, Tomorrow Belongs to Us. Lévesque said he was never so proud to be a Quebecer as that night.
Okay, now here's the adversary out in the open, and we'll be able to argue this thing to a decision, and we'll see what kind of separatism they want, what kind of support they have, and I was always certain in myself. I think around that time I had announced that separatism was dead. Why? Because separatism had only elected 7 people in 1970 when it was trying to sell separatism. The PQ had only elected 6 of them in 1973 when it was trying to sell separatism. And suddenly in 76 it was no longer talk of separatism. It was good government. We'll talk to you about separatism someday in a referendum, but right now it's just good government. You elect us for this. And people were fed up with Bourassa, so they voted for him. So I said, okay, now you know, fat's in the fire. Let's see what they've got and let's fight them. And I liked a good fight.
In 1976, Trudeau faced a new opponent in the House of Commons.
Not wishing to compete with the Prime Minister for blandness.
The young Joe Clark had been elected leader of the Conservative Party and proved a tenacious critic.
I knew he'd be perhaps a more dangerous opponent to me than Stanfield would be, because he was a tough little son of a gun sitting in the 3rd or 4th row of the House of Commons and shouting these, pointing his finger at me and shouting all kinds of questions to upset my balance or interrupting my speeches and so on. So I knew he'd be a feisty leader of the opposition, which he was.
In an immense country, you live on a local scale.
Joe Clark saw a Canada less centralized than Trudeau's.
Recognizing that we are fundamentally a community of communities.
The Prime Minister took great pleasure in deriding Joe Clark's promises to decentralize the country.
The pendulum will keep swinging until we end up with a community of communities or a federation of, confederation of shopping centers or whatever it is, and that's not my view of Canada.
In 1978, Trudeau was drawing René Lévesque into discussions about the Canadian Constitution. He had traveled to all the provincial capitals to explore the possibilities for constitutional renewal, but found that Lévesque was just as effective in rallying the other premiers to support his side.
He was playing a clever and charming game, and it's very soon after that that the meetings of premiers in the summer, the list of demands began to grow by leaps and bounds. Even Mr. Lévesque is the head of a separatist party, they would say, but he's not a separatist. He's just asking for a better deal for Quebec, and the way to keep Canada united would be to give a better deal to Quebec, but we want the same deal too.
In 1979, Trudeau convened a constitutional conference to discuss trading some powers between the federal and provincial levels of government, but he was stonewalled by the premiers.
You know, if we're bargaining, what more did you want from us? We haven't agreed on everything, but at some point, you should say, okay, they've showed at least, and I'm prepared to stand by what I've said now. I don't know how long I'll be in this chair. Hey, you haven't delivered anything to me.
That's right.
You haven't delivered anything.
No.
I haven't asked for anything yet. I've got a second list, like René Lévesque has.
Lévesque was clearly confident that the Prime Minister was on the way out. Trudeau ran out of time. He had to call an election even though his personal popularity had dropped along with the economic record of his government. There was even anger over a swimming pool built for him by private donors at 24 Sussex Drive, at a time when many Canadians were suffering financially. He decided to campaign on the Constitution, but the bloom was off the rose.
79 campaign was a disaster. I think it was a disaster because Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, wanted to talk about the Constitution. We wanted to talk about jobs and the economy. In that sense, it was, I guess, a terrible campaign. And the best moment in the campaign was how bad it was summed up in a rally that we had towards the end of the campaign in Toronto. We did our darndest to set it up in a way that all that the Prime Minister had to do at the time, Mr. Trudeau had to do, was just ignite it, just send them a message of hope and promise. We felt all the ingredients were there. And we had a full house, and it was terrific. And he got up and gave us a little speech about the Constitution. Right at the end, he said, and we'll bring it home. We'll bring the Constitution home.
We will bring it back and consult the Canadian people in a referendum. And that's the way we will do it.
And I said to myself, oh my God, you know, what's the Constitution? I mean, the Constitution, my mother thinks, is a cereal. What's he going to do, take cereal home? I mean, it was just going to be a disastrous thing, and you could palpably feel the support in the crowd just go down because nobody knew what he was talking about.
Encounter 79.
In the 1979 TV debate, the pressure was on Trudeau to turn the campaign around, or at least stop Clark from getting a majority government. The moderator and a panel of newsmen were in control, but the candidates seemed to want to slug it out on their own.
Mr. Clark, you comment on the first point,
sure,
and then you can move to the second.
You'd like it'd probably be better, Mr. Broadbent, if we both cooled down a little bit and
I'm very cool.
carry,
I just want
carry
some honest,
this debate this way. Sure.
My memory of that debate is that I was incensed that the debate was being run by 3 or 4 pressmen with a president of it, and they were deciding what questions would be asked. When the answers were long enough, they'd cut us in. So you don't remember what you even decided in Kingston?
The question of equalization, a number of them we could go through.
Equalization?
That's not
Mr. King
really the
started it. Mr. Saint Laurent continued it.
Sure. The point is that you've been singularly unsuccessful in working with the premiers of Canada.
What about
have an
culture?
interest in common fields.
What about
and
communication?
That they should work together.
Gentlemen, it's very difficult for our viewers to follow when you're both talking at once. Now, finish your comment, please, Mr. Clark, and then I'm anxious Mr. Trudeau has an opportunity to reply.
Then he'd call on the press to ask the question, and they, by rote, they were the stars rather than us, and I guess I didn't like that.
But you won the television debate hands down. You saved the day, and the result was a minority government. No doubt about it.
This is election 79, and the story tonight is that the Conservatives are on their way to winning this election with the minority. What's still at issue, though, is whether Joe Clark will be able to form a government.
But I think it is my duty at this time to recommend to my colleagues that we hand the government over, and that I recommend to the Governor General that he ask Mr. Clark to form a government. Mr. Clark.
It looked like the end of Pierre Trudeau's political career.
With all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it's still a beautiful world. Strive to be happy.
On June 4th, 1979, at Rideau Hall, Trudeau turned over the government to Joe Clark.
Tell us how you feel leaving office.
Feel free.
And I think I must have, at the time, put on a pretty brave front that, well, this is a defeat, but we'll be back. I think which made me particularly annoyed with the Liberal Party was when I saw so many Liberals who had been elected on my coattails, and a lot of senators who had been put in the Senate by my fiat, were beginning to say Trudeau must go, and now's the time to get a new leader, and so on and so on. I think that produced the contrary effect in me, and I sort of said, well, damn it, I'm not going to go if they want to throw me out.
That summer, Trudeau took a long canoe trip through the Canadian North, and then went hiking in China and Tibet. He returned in a carefree mood to be confronted by his political advisors.
I had a pretty wholesome beard, and I was going to keep it on. Parliament was going to convene within the next few days, and Coots said, look, if you want to give the signal that you're out for good, keep your beard. If you think you might want to stay on, you damn well better cut it off, which I did.
Trudeau watched Joe Clark move somewhat unsteadily to take control of the government. The Clark administration made several blunders in both foreign and domestic policy, but were let off easy because of Trudeau's less than inspired performance as leader of the opposition.
I'm going to give him a fair chance to see if he can pull a clean, neat Canada out of this mess. And if he can, well, he's a better man than I am. And if he can't, then the electorate will come back to the Liberal Party. But I wasn't a very good leader of the opposition in those days because I realized that governing was a pretty difficult job in the kind of economic circumstances that the whole world was going through, and the various shocks that Canada had been put through too.
In opposition, Trudeau got to spend a lot more time with his three boys and gained a better sense of the personal toll on family life that politics demands. He became less and less willing to pay it. On November 20th, 1979, Trudeau decided to bring his political career to an end.
There's no easy way or ideal time to leave, and there are always strong public and private reasons, both for going and for staying on.
And I had young children then, and I was, well, I loved them, and I wanted to look after them, and I think at that point I told Peltier, well, somebody else can look after Canada, but I'm the only one who can look after my children, and therefore that's my duty to leave politics to bring up my family.
Joe Clark's Conservative government was rid of its most potent enemy, but moved dramatically to reverse its good fortune. 3 weeks after Trudeau's resignation announcement, the Conservative government brought in an unpopular budget with draconian tax increases. Then, to the astonishment of many on both sides of the House, they allowed the budget to be overturned in a Commons vote.
Yeas,
Pour 139, 139. Nays, contre 133, 133.
Mr. Speaker, I rise on a point of order. The government has lost a vote on a matter which we have no alternative but to regard as a question of confidence, and I simply want to advise the House that I will be seeing His Excellency the Governor General tomorrow morning.
Clark asked the Governor General to call an election. In the Liberal Party, there was a great deal of arguing about whether Trudeau should come back as leader. At the same time, he was being coy about his intentions.
I conjured up the true tale of that prime minister who came from Yunnan province and who'd been asked by the emperor to come back to be prime minister again, and he'd say, "I had enough of it. I'd only come back if the emperor asked me 3 times on bended knee to come back." And I would tell that to my staff, and I'd explain the legend, and that meant that caucus had to ask me, and the party had to ask me, and my friends had to ask me.
Trudeau consulted with his oldest friends about what to do. There was a sharp difference of opinion.
Remember phoning Pelletier in Paris because he had the distant observer viewpoint, and he said, sure, you got to go back because you're going to win anyhow. Had another friend like Macalon who didn't think we would win, and therefore, because out of friendship, he was sort of saying, well, don't come back, you're going to be slaughtered. I think Jean Marchand was more or less of that view too. You had a good go at it. You're going to be defeated, and therefore, why go through it again? You've done your bit. We've had our go. We've done the Official Languages Act. We've done some things we wanted, so don't come back. So there was obviously a division, but by and large, the group around me, I think, bended its knee and sort of said, we're asking you to come back, humbly, sir.
Trudeau returned. His handlers wanted to let the Conservatives defeat themselves. Trudeau's campaign role was reduced. The spotlight was turned on to the unpopular tax increases of Joe Clark.
The Liberal Party has launched a peekaboo campaign. They let Pierre Trudeau out for an hour each day and hope nobody will notice him.
And then, of course, the 1980 election was an easy election for us. When you think about it, things went very well.
And I think that was the bookend to the 79 campaign. It was a continuum. I don't think there was a separation between the two in the public's mind.
I felt that I had talked enough about the Constitution in 79. I didn't have to do it again.
Exactly, exactly.
The 1980 campaign was a breeze for the Liberals. Trudeau was back in power with a majority government, and like Scrooge on Christmas morning, was delighted with his second chance. Fate had given him an opportunity to rewrite the ending of his career, and he was anxious to make the most of it.
Well, welcome to the 1980s.
When he was defeated in the 1979 election, it looked as if the turbulent prime ministership of Pierre Elliott Trudeau had come to an inauspicious end. Had his political career concluded at that point, he might well have gone into history as a leader of great promise who accomplished less than expected. He made progress on bilingualism and reducing poverty, but many of his famous Just Society policies had fallen by the wayside. His attempts at constitutional reform had failed. Separatism was stronger than ever. With his surprise re-election in 1980, fate gave him a chance to leave a more lasting mark in Canadian history. In Trudeau's last term, his first challenge was to counter the threat of Quebec separatism. He entered federal politics years before to show that Quebecers could thrive inside Canada, and to give French Canadians a larger role in the operation of the federal government. With the Quebec referendum approaching, Trudeau redoubled his efforts on that front. Quebecers were given the powerful energy and justice portfolios in the government, and many other influential positions both inside and outside of cabinet.
I was always trying to move some French-speaking Canadian into some post that had never been occupied before by a French Canadian. At one point we had the French-speaking Governor General, we had the French-speaking Prime Minister, we had the French-speaking Chief of the General Staff, we had a French-speaking Canadian head of the RCMP. So we were establishing, I think to the delight of Quebecers, that they could help run this country just as well as anyone from Ontario or anywhere else. And that's why I think we always got such massive support from the Quebec voters. You know, towards the end, we were having 74 out of 75 seats elected for my party in Ottawa.
Trudeau's nemesis, the separatist Quebec Premier René Lévesque, called his referendum in the spring of 1980. His Parti Québécois forces surged ahead in the polls. At rallies around the province, thousands were converting to the independence cause. The Federalist campaign under Quebec Liberal leader Claude Ryan was in trouble, but Ryan seemed oblivious to the danger.
I think the first onslaught was won by the PQ. They had in their National Assembly a debate on the referendum to pass the law and to approve the question and so on. It was won hands down by the PQ. It was masterly organized. The speeches were timely. They were televised live. The Liberals were trying to explain the rather complicated white paper, which was called I forget, a yellow paper or some other color, and how we should stay in Canada. We're all federalists, but we're going to try and go for this, that, and the next power. It sort of drowned itself in its own morass, whereas the PQ were coming out with pride and firmness and so on. So that was a loss, I think, handed to the Federalist forces at stage one.
After the Federalists were beaten in the formal referendum debate, Trudeau was pushed by his advisors to visit Claude Ryan at his home in Montreal to convince the provincial Liberal leader to change strategy. The Prime Minister's aides were extremely worried by polls showing that they were losing the referendum battle. Trudeau convinced Ryan to relinquish his total control of the Federalist campaign, but the two men were not going to get along any better than they had in the past. In his previous job as the influential editor of the nationalist Le Devoir, Ryan had little more than scorn for Trudeau's policies, and the feeling was mutual.
He returned to what he, I guess, never ceased to be, a Quebec nationalist first, and a believer in the distinct societies, special status, as he had begun calling it in his Devoir days, and he was still trying to solve the constitutional debate by special powers to Quebec, and I felt that that isn't what he had been elected for. He'd been elected in order to defeat the Separatist Party, which means keep Canada strong.
Halfway through the referendum campaign, the separatist forces stumbled.
Yvette, sa petite sœur, est joyeuse et gentille.
When PQ Minister Lise Payette suggested that only traditional, unliberated women would support federalism, thousands of women filled the Montreal Forum to reject the claim and demonstrate their support for Canada. René Lévesque said that all were welcome in his independence crusade, but then made several comments that were seen as denigrating to non-Francophone Quebecers. He even cast aspersions on the English part of Trudeau's Quebec heritage.
It was Levesque that had said that his name is Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and this is the Elliott taking over, and that's the English side, and therefore that's why we can't expect any just deal from him. He's in Ottawa, he's a traitor anyhow, and of course, and you know, they'd never call me Pierre Trudeau, they'd always call me Elliott, so it was obviously an attack on or part of my origins.
In his final public appearance of the referendum campaign, at a rally in traditional Parti Québécois territory at the Paul Sauvé Arena in Montreal, Trudeau turned Levesque's slur to advantage.
Bien sûr, mon nom est Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Oui, Elliott, c'était le nom de ma mère, voyez-vous. C'était le nom des Elliott qui sont venus au Canada il y a plus de 200 ans. C'est le nom des Elliott qui sont installés à Saint-Gabriel-de-Brandon. Vous pouvez encore voir leur tombe au cimetière il y a plus de 100 ans. C'est ça, les Elliott. Puis mon nom est québécois, mon nom est canadien aussi. Puis c'est ça, mon nom.
And as we got to that end speech, I felt that we were going to win. I always hoped we would. I always knew we would, but this time I felt it.
These people in Quebec and in Canada want to split it up. They want to take it away from their children. They want to break it down. No, that's our answer.
Federalism has carried the day. It's a stunning defeat for René Levesque and his step-by-step approach to gaining sovereignty in Quebec.
S'il vous plaît. Si je vous ai bien compris, vous êtes en train de dire à la prochaine fois.
After the referendum results were announced, I felt it important to not proclaim a great victory. I remember, on the contrary, making the point that we had all lost a little bit because we had been fighting within ourselves, within Quebecers, and families had been divided and friends had broken up over it. But of course, in my heart, I was happy that we'd proved, as I wanted to, that even on a tricked question, the Quebec people had voted against any form of separation.
In 1980, shortly after the Trudeau government won its struggle in Quebec, it faced trouble on the Western Front. Now Albertans were feeling alienated and angry. The reason was Trudeau's national energy program. In the 1980 election, Trudeau promised to tax oil and gas exports, mostly from Alberta, to subsidize lower energy prices for the rest of the country. The promise brought a lot of votes in the eastern consuming provinces, but the Liberals were almost wiped out in the West. The oilmen were furious and threatened to shut down operations rather than accept what they saw as a federal tax grab. Their revolt was led by the former Alberta Premier Peter Lougheed, who is still angry about the Trudeau National Energy Program.
They were getting, in Ontario, in the middle of this, more out of the oil than Alberta, who owned it. Now, is that sharing?
There was a floor and there was a ceiling. And if you still had that national energy policy that our government brought in, you wouldn't be suffering from the lower prices of oil. You'd be getting
You're not going to tell me in the summer or the September or October of 1992 that you're still going to defend the national energy program, are you?
I would think that you would be defending it too, because you've just made the case.
You created with that program such an intense anti-Ottawa feeling in Western Canada, centered here in Alberta. We did.
The Ottawa feeling goes back to the 1880s.
Never with the intensity that's there.
Through the whole period of since you entered Confederation in 1905, Alberta has always tended to buck the current and to not send to Ottawa people on the government side, because you felt that the government was representative of central Canada and was
the intensity that struck the individual citizen, the intensity of antagonism, really came to a peak with the national energy program you brought in. And that was in part because you had no representation here, in part the incredible shift of wealth at our one chance, in our view, our one chance to establish ourselves with viability in the province. And you brought it in, right in the middle of it.
In 1980, the conflict between Trudeau and Lougheed was temporarily resolved by a negotiated pricing agreement.
But Peter, you signed that agreement. We toasted it with champagne.
We signed the agreement. I shouldn't have toasted you with the champagne. That wasn't a good political move. I, living here in the province, had to make a decision as premier. And the decision was this: do we die with our basic industry, or do we just bleed? We decided to bleed. And that's what that agreement was about.
The Trudeau National Energy Program depended on an ever-increasing price for oil. When oil prices crashed, the program made little sense. Vast amounts of money were spent drilling for oil in the far north, but the reserves discovered were unprofitable unless prices were much higher. Trudeau looks back at the fight as part of the ongoing struggle between provincial rights and the national interest in the Canadian Federation.
You know, every premier in our system and every provincial government is elected by the people to stick up for the interests of the people of that particular region. That is to say, the provincial premier must fight for his province. But the government of Canada and its ministers and cabinet and prime minister are elected to try and seek the good of the whole of the country. And therefore, sometimes it'll have to say no to one region and yes to another in order to redistribute equality of opportunity. It does mean that in a federal system, there's practically always a tension between the provincial premiers and the federal government.
In 1980, Trudeau's battles with the provinces were only just beginning. He was going to change Canada's constitution whether the premiers liked it or not. The collision was more than he bargained for. Just days after the Quebec referendum, the Prime Minister invited the premiers to 24 Sussex Drive. During the referendum campaign, Quebecers were promised constitutional change. Now, with Lévesque dispirited and defeated, Trudeau was ready to press home a deal. The premiers agreed that Justice Minister Jean Chrétien would travel the country to seek the basis of an arrangement, including a new Charter of Rights. Through the summer, Chrétien met with provincial ministers and officials assembling an ambitious package. But in the fall, most premiers decided they didn't like it. René Lévesque had revived and was gathering a group of premiers that would try to stop Trudeau's constitutional offensive. An early convert was Newfoundland's Brian Peckford.
We've all talked here today about the concept of Canada, the vision of Canada, and that's what it really comes down to, because everything flows from that. Both yourself, Mr. Prime Minister, and Mr. Lévesque articulated two different visions of Canada. And I would have to side with the theory advocated by Mr. Lévesque. There's no question about that.
Certainly all I can say is that the people of Quebec have shown last May that they didn't agree with the view of Canada held by Mr. Lévesque.
In Quebec City, René Lévesque decided to take a bold gamble. He would sign away Quebec's traditional demand for a constitutional veto in exchange for a new alliance of provinces against Trudeau. The alliance was called the Gang of Eight.
say that every province was equal, which Mr. Lévesque did, convinced me that he really wasn't going to negotiate. He was using the Gang of Eight to block us.
The Gang of Eight insisted that there be no Charter of Rights in the new constitution. Trudeau was astonished.
Look, there's absolutely no deal. You guys are laughing at me. You're going back to square one. So we're going to go unilaterally, and we'll go to London and ask for what London will have to give us, because it's the Parliament of Canada speaking to him. And Premier Lyon of Manitoba sort of said, but if you do that, you're going to tear the country apart. And I said, look, if we tear the country, if the country is going to be torn apart because we bring back a constitution after 115 years of confederation, and because we put a charter in, a Charter of Rights, which most of you provinces have anyhow, then the country deserves to be torn up.
Only 2 premiers supported Trudeau's move to bring home and change the constitution without provincial consent: Richard Hatfield of New Brunswick and Bill Davis of Ontario. In the House of Commons, when the government introduced its constitution legislation, the 8 provinces against Trudeau found an important ally. Conservative opposition leader Joe Clark used every tactic in the book to disrupt Parliament and stop Trudeau. The Conservative filibuster worked. Trudeau agreed to wait until the Supreme Court ruled on the legality of his constitutional proposal. And looking back, he admires Joe Clark's tenacity.
He single-handedly prevented the unilateral patriation of the Constitution. Clark, who believed in the community of communities rather than in my concept of a strong central government, Clark was following his own belief and upsetting my apple cart.
The Supreme Court of Canada derailed Trudeau's unilateral patriation plan, declaring it technically legal but unconventional. It was an ambiguous ruling, but the judges were clearly suggesting that the First Ministers meet to try again. Trudeau convened the Make or Break Constitutional Conference in November 1981. Meeting for several days behind closed doors, the 2 sides circled each other warily, until Trudeau issued a surprise challenge designed to break René Lévesque away from his allies in the Gang of Eight.
When I saw we were getting nowhere, I turned to Mr. Lévesque and I said, well, how'd it be that rather than break up in disarray and continue our fight on the doorstep of Westminster in Britain, how'd it be if we had a referendum, if we got patriation first, nobody can object to that, if we got patriation first, and then gave ourselves 2 years to solve our problem of amending formula and a charter, and failing that, then we'd consult the people. And Lévesque, I think instinctively, without remembering that he was in the Gang of Eight, answered, well, I can buy that. So we have a new alliance between the Quebec government and the Canadian government. So you would patriate and amend, but nothing... And the cat is among the pigeons.
Lévesque's allies in the Gang of Eight were extremely unhappy that he departed from the Common Front strategy without consulting them.
So he was the first to have broken the United Front, and the premiers of the other provinces were seething mad, because my scheme would have meant that these premiers, to stop me, would have had to campaign with Lévesque against patriation of a constitution, against a Charter of Rights, and many of them had charters in their own provincial constitutions, and it would have been associating with an outright premier who believed in an independent Quebec, and I don't think they relished the idea of that referendum. So they said, well, look, the Gang of Eight is broken up. There's a deal between Trudeau and Lévesque. Let's start negotiating on our own, which they did.
2 provinces met quietly with Jean Chrétien and worked out a possible compromise. The Gang of Eight would get its constitutional amending formula, and Trudeau would get his Charter of Rights, but the charter would have a notwithstanding clause to allow provinces to sometimes override it. the Prime Minister was extremely reluctant to allow any watering down of the Charter. Chrétien remembers that at first Trudeau rejected the deal.
So you organize a meeting at 9 o'clock at 24 Sussex, with a group of ministers. I made my proposition. You shut it down a little bit quickly, I felt, but anyway, and I was losing the game. But suddenly you were called out, and you came back, and your attitude has changed a bit.
Bill Davis had told me that if we didn't accept this kind of a deal, he would no longer be part of the two provinces which were our only support at that point.
That 11th hour phone call from Ontario's Bill Davis was the critical intervention. In a frantic night of negotiating in Ottawa, all provinces except Quebec signed on to the compromise deal. The Quebec delegation was staying across the river in Hull and was not involved in the deal-making. Lévesque discovered the surprise agreement the next morning and was bitter that he had been abandoned by his allies. He felt stabbed in the back.
I guess I felt that we had bested Lévesque, that he had spoilt his own strategy. He was disorganized, confused and improvising and probably a good tactician, but not much of a strategist. Did you think we could get it at some point, or did you think maybe with a separatist government we couldn't, or were you hopeful?
At one time, you asked Mr. Lévesque, what's wrong with this deal? And Lévesque said 1, 2, 3. I don't remember exactly what it was. And he said, okay, let's make a deal. These 3 will be off the table and we'll assign on the rest. And at that moment, it was a very critical moment. He said, you know, I will never sign. And it was kind of sad because he was alone.
What they did this morning is beyond description. I'm sorry.
Well, he said himself, and I remember it being quoted to me, he said, Trudeau screwed me. I was had, and so on. I think he realized, as the gambler that he was, that he'd gambled big and he'd lost. After that, we were going to invent myths about how they'd been left out during a night of the long knives. But what happened, in fact, is that I was dealing with 10 provinces, 9 of which were prepared to gamble and compromise, and the other was prepared to gamble but not to lose. He wasn't trying to improve the Constitution, he was a separatist.
Lévesque warned that one day English Canada would regret the way Quebec was treated.
In spite of the joyous outpourings of most of my colleagues while they were giving their reactions to that, maybe second thoughts and further events will make them understand that this could have incalculable consequences.
Lévesque's remarks that day were prophetic. Some of the premiers who abandoned him and made a deal with Trudeau now regret the isolation of Quebec at that 1981 conference. One of those who has had second thoughts is former Alberta Premier Peter Lougheed.
Why did you want to take the risk of an agreement with 9 provinces and the federal government in which Quebec would take a walk?
I didn't want that to happen. On the contrary, you'll recall that when the 10 of you, the 10 premiers came up in October 1980 with the Chateau Consensus, where you were asking for a lot of powers to be transferred to the provinces before you would even consider patriation, I said, well, we'll go alone. And it's still my belief today that it would have been better if we had gone alone and had whatever difficulties we would have had in Britain, rather than have one province out.
Aren't you worried in doing this, if you found yourself in a negotiation, which you did in November, that we were involved in, and then Quebec takes a walk, and we've got a country where the legitimacy, and I use that word, of the Constitution is questioned by that?
But Quebec wouldn't have taken a walk if you hadn't broken up the Gang of Eight. And my feeling in going into that conference is that we would get you all or we wouldn't get any of you. I never dreamt that you people would break your Gang of Eight. And perhaps even in my heart I was hoping that you wouldn't. But I reverse your own question to me. Weren't you people conscious of the fact that if you broke the Gang of Eight, then Lévesque would be left alone?
Remember, though, you were the initiator, and we were responding to stop you moving unilaterally. Right. You knew that our Gang of Eight we had a mandate, and that mandate was strictly and entirely only to stopping you moving unilaterally.
I understand that some may have second thoughts now because they are rereading history the way it's being rewritten. But in reality, they knew that what we were doing was legal, that it was conventional, and that it was final. And it was their deal which was on the table, almost more their deal than mine, since we had most of their amending formula, and we had gutted the charter with a notwithstanding clause.
On the day of the ceremony proclaiming the Constitution Act of 1982, Trudeau pointed to the Charter of Rights as the most important accomplishment of the deal.
We now have a charter which defines the kind of country in which we wish to live and guarantees the basic rights and freedoms which each of us shall enjoy as a citizen of Canada.
Sometimes you sing the praises of the Charter, sometimes you refer to it as flawed or even gutted. Do you feel ambivalent about it?
No, I have a very simple position on it. It's that better a charter which is flawed than no charter which is perfect.
Once a year, former world leaders gather under the auspices of the United Nations to debate global problems. At this meeting in Mexico, the retired presidents and prime ministers receive a welcome which harkens back to their days in the spotlight. Pierre Trudeau plays a central role here. In power, he came to be regarded as a senior statesman by many of the other leaders. He long outlasted most of them in office, and he used his international prominence and experience in several high-profile crusades. In the 1980s, strong philosophical differences divided the leaders of the Western world. On one side were the neoconservatives like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. On the other side were Pierre Trudeau and many other left-leaning prime ministers and presidents. At summit meetings, Trudeau remembers the anti-communist interventions of Ronald Reagan, shocking French President François Mitterrand.
President Reagan launched into one of his anecdotes about how when he was president of Actors' Equity in Hollywood, back in the 40s, I guess, he had seen communism at work, and there was this priest who had been trained in Moscow, but who was really an agent of the KGB, and he was sowing discord amongst the actors in the union in order to really destroy capitalism. And that was his anecdote, and you know, everybody knew that President Reagan saw communists under his bed every night, and he was afraid they were there. So after the meeting, President Mitterrand came to me and said, "Is this man for real? Does he really believe that the Russians or the Soviets would bring an American priest to train him into their Marxist thing and then send them back to be the spokesman for the Actors' Equity?" He said, "This man is really inconceivable." And I had to agree with him, but he was a great storyteller, President Reagan was, and a very likable guy. So it was good to have at a meeting like that, but not for policy exchanges.
The divisions among world leaders were striking in one area where Trudeau took a leading role, the North-South dialogue. At a 1981 summit in Cancun, Mexico, there was a debate about how a balance could be struck between the needs of the industrial northern powers and the far poorer, underdeveloped countries of the southern hemisphere.
Excelentísimo, señor presidente.
Trudeau was asked to chair the conference and was again taken aback by Ronald Reagan's approach to the Third World.
You know, all they have to do if they're having trouble selling their coffee or their cocoa or their bananas or whatever it is, depending on the country, and he applied this to the Sahel too, the starving peoples of the southern Sahara Desert. All they have to do is have a free market, and then capital will move there and create industries and build the schools. And I said, well, what about the sewers and the water? And oh, well, that can be done too if you open the market. So he really had a fixation about the free market being able to solve problems not only in the United States, where incidentally the free market is not all that free either, as we know, when the government subsidizes a lot of technological progress through the defense industry. But for third world countries, this was his remedy, and it was quite simplistic and quite false.
Liftoff. Liftoff. In the early 1980s, U.S.-Soviet détente collapsed, and a new arms race began. Pierre Trudeau became more and more concerned about the possibility of nuclear war, and decided that the last great cause in his term of office would be a peace initiative. The anti-nuclear cause had long been dear to him. Along with his friends Thérèse Casgrain and Gerard Peltier, he had been active in the peace movement before entering politics in the 1960s.
I was seeing these retired admirals and generals and retired politicians after they leave office sort of becoming almost peaceniks. And I said, well, I'm not going to do that. I was for peace before entering politics, and I'm not going to wait till I'm out to take some very deeply felt gesture. And that's when I decided I would try and change the trend line of escalating, hysterical denunciations of evil empires from one side and from the other. And it came to a head when the Korean airline was shot down, and we were seeing this as a criminal act, the Soviet Union, and this is the type of thing they would do if we didn't stop them in their tracks. And at the same time, President Reagan, a month later, was invading Grenada because he was afraid that subversion was going to come from this little island and overwhelm the United States. You know, it was getting mad.
Trudeau decided that a public confrontation with President Reagan about nuclear weapons would get him nowhere. So he prepared the ground for his peace initiatives by building a more positive working relationship with the president, even in front of the anti-American protesters on Parliament Hill.
I think maybe we imported them. I think they're ours.
Hey, guys, when I go to the United States, I'm not met with these kind of signs. You know, the Americans have some beefs against us, too. But we receive them politely. Now, how about a great cheer for President Reagan? Hey, come on.
I knew I needed to at least make my idea acceptable to President Reagan, and I said, look, you're a great communicator, and you're known as such, and which was true. And you keep telling me that you believe in peace. At each summit where I raise the subject, you say you believe in peace, and you eventually was even to say at one of the summits, what more can I do? You know, I send my people to the negotiating table in Geneva, and well, I said, you can use your great skills as a communicator to join me and other leaders who do believe in peace. And if we believe that the Soviets are intent on war, let's at least show that our first choice is peace.
Trudeau's attempt to win over President Reagan came to a head during his visit to the White House on December 15, 1983. The atmosphere around the Washington meeting was somewhat tense because a U.S. official had said Trudeau was acting like a pot-smoking peacenik and embarrassing his NATO partners. Trudeau lashed back that the official was a pipsqueak.
Third-rate and third-level pipsqueaks who say that I'm not allowed to talk about peace because somehow we haven't pulled our weight in NATO. That is baloney.
Trudeau's peace mission also ran into resistance at Western summit meetings, especially from the Prime Minister of Great Britain.
Margaret Thatcher often acted as President Reagan's spokesperson because she articulated well many of these same subjects. But in my arguments with Margaret Thatcher, it was always, if I said something, look, there's more atomic weapons unearthed than is needed to destroy each other several times over. So why do we need more all the time? You know, let's talk a bit more peace at this summit. We got to not only try and solve today's problems, but look ahead, and that should be the role of the summiteers, to formulate policies for the future as well as answering today's challenge. And she said, well, Pierre, when you talk like that, you're really encouraging the Soviets to go on with their Marxism and their approach to increasing arms. And it was really the ultimate condemnation of saying, here I was talking for the Soviets amongst this meeting of civilized capitalist Western countries.
A controversy over the cruise missile undermined Trudeau's peace mission on the home front. In 1984, the cruise was the latest strategic weapon, and the NATO alliance needed to test it. Canada was asked to permit the tests in the skies over Alberta. Trudeau was reluctant, but was under pressure from his NATO allies to allow the tests to go ahead.
Some of my friends, Helmut Schmidt, who was a former defense minister and who had been my friend as chancellor, sort of said, Pierre, you're part of NATO and you've got to do something. You've reduced your troops, you've reduced your budget, but if you're part of the club, you got to help the club. It's the decision of NATO to deploy the cruise. The least you can do is let them test it, an unarmed missile over Canada.
Anti-nuclear protesters filled the streets in Canada to push the government in the other direction. But eventually, Trudeau authorized the cruise tests to proceed.
You don't start a war with a weapon that takes 3 hours and gives your enemy 3 hours to notice that you're declaring a nuclear war on him. Therefore, it was a response weapon rather than an attack weapon, a first strike weapon. And that made sense to me, and we finally did it. And of course, the explanations were never accepted, but they were valid nonetheless.
Trudeau's peace mission seemed inconclusive at the time. But within a few years, the treaty terms he advocated were picked up and incorporated into the peace agreements signed by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. The 1984 peace mission was Trudeau's last hurrah as Prime Minister. When it concluded, he returned to Canada and prepared to put an end to his political career. He would do it in the style to which the country had become accustomed. There is something about snowstorms that brought on Pierre Trudeau's big career decisions. He remembers that it was on a solitary walk in the snow in February 1968 that he decided to enter the race for the job of Prime Minister. 16 years later, on February 29, 1984, he went out alone in another snowstorm, this time preparing to walk away from the job.
Well, by '84, you'll recall that the Parti Québécois in Quebec was falling apart. The economy had started growing again. The Constitution had been repatriated. I had my peace mission, and so I had done what I had gotten in politics to do. My kids were entering their teens, and I felt it was time to spend some time with them. And I had had a good run at it. I thought it would be time for somebody else to take over.
But I went to sleep, just in case I'd changed my mind overnight, and I did, and I woke up. It was great. I use the old cliche, this is the first day of the rest of my life. Here we are.
Many historians are kind to Pierre Trudeau, giving him credit for his role in the battle against separatism in Quebec and the significant advances he made as Prime Minister in the areas of bilingualism and social policy. Some have judged him harshly for running up massive deficits in his time of office, leaving a national debt to burden his successors and generations to come. Historian Michael Bliss teaches at the University of Toronto.
When you went out of office, the deficit was over $34 billion a year, and there was a sense that most of our economic problems were had probably gotten worse in the past 15 years. And this is where Trudeau was very good on Constitution, Trudeau was very good on official languages, but the Trudeau governments didn't know how to run the Canadian economy.
Well, we brought the level of poverty from when I took office, it was something around 22, 23%. And we brought the incidence down to 12 or 11. We were more interested in lowering the level of poverty than in those who were worried about the accumulation of debt. And the result is we did leave a high deficit on the books. But it wasn't mainly a foreign-held deficit. It was a debt of Canadians to Canadians. And we felt it more important in our time to manage the economy so that the poor would get a better slice of the pie, as it were.
In retirement, as he travels the country, Pierre Trudeau sees evidence of his legacy as Prime Minister. Schools are a favorite touchstone. This is the French Immersion School in White Rock, British Columbia, where the latest generation of English Canadians is struggling with the intricacies of the French language. It's a little nerve-wracking to be under the tutelage of a former Prime Minister.
Elle est très grande. J'ai compris tout de suite.
Across the country, 300,000 children are enrolled in French immersion education. More than 1 million children have graduated from the program in the last 2 decades. Trudeau believes the French immersion program is creating a critical mass of Canadians with an interest and ability to overcome the barriers of language and bind the country together. He sees it as a sign that Canada will remain intact and have a bright future.
I have in mind those children in White Rock, British Columbia, as far west as you can get, or almost in Canada, singing "O Canada" in French, doing their homework in French, talking to me in French. I think there's that amount of goodwill existent in these new generations who understand more that the world is one and that Canada is not isolated, and therefore we shouldn't be isolated between Canadians. So I'm optimistic.
The political career of Canada's 15th Prime Minister came to an end at the Liberal Convention of 1984. The Ottawa Civic Arena was filled with mementos of his 1968 leadership campaign. That night, Trudeau spoke of his years of confrontations with the superpowers, with the multinational corporations, and with the provincial premiers.
Whenever the going was tough, I realized that if our cause was right, all we had to do to win was to talk over the heads of the premiers, over the heads of the multinationals, over the heads of the superpowers, to the people of this land, to the people of Canada.
Trudeau asked all Canadians to lend their hands to the building of Canada's future.
Our hopes are high. Our faith in the people is great. Our courage is strong. And our dreams for this beautiful country will never die.
I feel that the Canadian people and I did dream together. We rebuilt, renewed, strengthened, and completed this country we all carry within ourselves. I look back on those days and the people I met with warm memories. And now, as long as there are fascinating new places to explore, new pathways to discover through the forests, new stars to notice in the wilderness sky, new experiences to share, and books to read, I will, God willing, remain a happy man.